Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the conveners for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. So my paper today examines a British quote-unquote presence in 18th century Europe by focusing on an extraordinary moment in international relations, and this moment in international relations then producing its own extraordinary transnational archive. So the British group at stake is the expatriate population living in revolutionary Paris, and this emerges for posterity thanks to policing measures undertaken as part of the French Revolutionary Terror. In particular, in October 1793, a mass arrest decree targets all subjects of George III living in France. Broadly esteemed as friends of freedom around 1789, 4 years later, the British were being accorded a leading role in revolutionary diatribe. Here I show you official propaganda imagery dating from early 1794, depicting Pitt and George III sharpening daggers for use in assassinations in France and preparing bags of gold to fund traitors and enemies to France. The radicalism of the 1793 arrest measure aimed at Britons living in France is matched by a revolutionary zeal for paperwork. And my research retraces this extensive paper trail in the case of the French capital. The surviving records are incomplete, but quantifying those which are extant brings up a baseline total of over 500 individuals living in Paris at this juncture who are subjects of George III by birth. This archival windfall also includes hundreds of petitions and appeals by those seeking release, together with other personalia. This then is a policing archive, but also a kind of transnational social history archive, albeit one shot through with enforced narratives or compulsory autobiographical activity, to draw on the terms coined by Carolyn Steedman in another 18th century context. The mass arrest of civilians on account of their purported enemy status went against conventional practices as these had developed over the 1700s. As the British Home Secretary had observed in Parliament as recently as May 1793, even if the law of nations tradition prohibited in times of war all intercourse with each other, it was nevertheless the case that in modern times, including the early period of the French Revolutionary Wars, that law had been modified as far as the safety of countries would admit. During the final wars with Britain during the old regime, the French authorities had gone out of their way positively to encourage British travellers, traders, and expatriates to continue to reside or travel to France, seeing them as an economic asset rather than as a threat. The dragnet aimed at the British and Irish population in France in late 1793 therefore appears as a shocking departure, and one which might be posited as one of the elements which have led some historians to characterize the conflicts of 1789 to 1815 as the first total war. In David Bell's terms, an era of apocalyptic conflict involving recourse to measures once condemned as barbaric. In this connection, we can recall too that the October 1793 arrest measures targeting British civilian subjects in France would be joined later during the Terror by the notorious decree of 7 Prairial, forbidding the taking of British and Hanoverian prisoners on the battlefield at the edges of France. So this kind of vision that any British person encountered either goes to jail or doesn't get taken prisoner on the front lines. In international relations scholarship, genealogies of the creation of the category of enemy alien and aliens have cast the arrest measures aimed at foreigners in revolutionary France, with this October 1793 decree aimed at the British being the standout measure. These have been cast as setting a decisive marker for subsequent punitive mishandling of civilians in wartime down to the present. Seen from such a perspective, this conjuncture may be said to have launched, as the scholar Daniela Cagliotti has recently written, quote, a trend toward the identification of the enemy state with any of its subjects. This meant that it would be felt in enduring ways, given the auspicious, far-reaching future that such an approach to enemy foreigners, or those thus labelled, would have in subsequent history at a global scale. In the first instance, this reprised by Napoleon, and then especially in the world wars of the 20th century. My interest here, though, involves different starting points. Recounting the mass arrest of British subjects during the French Revolutionary Terror as a kind of teleology for understanding the modern category of enemy aliens tends, I would argue, to obscure and oversimplify as much as it reveals. Instead, I'm more interested in using the surviving records around this episode from 1793 in order to pose historical questions, such as who were the people who became caught up in the enactment of these measures? How had events brought about their targeting in the first place? And what did these people have to say about the way that they were being categorized? This polemical moment of mass arrest was one constructed around a privileging of national difference, and it involved seeking to nationalize, in effect, a civilian presence as partisan components of an international conflict. Yet I argue that the actual people under scrutiny, these British quote-unquote expatriates, or perhaps a more neutral and apposite term would be depatriots, were often inadequately describable using such national binaries. In targeting Britons in France for arrest, the Montagnard government of the Terror anticipated that it would be collecting a useful supply of wartime hostages while also neutralizing a high-profile nest of suspects. What it instead found itself grappling with was a motley body of individuals, including some who did not fit smoothly into black and white national categories. Factoring such transnational people and trajectories into the existing historiography of 18th century Britain, insofar as this relates to Europe, is a further challenge here. And in this paper, I seek to review and question some of the conceptual underpinnings of that existing historiography. In what follows, I'll begin by discussing that historiographical and conceptual picture before turning to consider the 1793 arrests via three optics. First, the turnaround in the representational fortunes of the British in France, which led to their becoming seen as a particular threat. Secondly, the quantitative picture of the Paris-based population which emerges from the 1793 arrests. And finally, a particular focus on some of the transnational trajectories which this conjuncture is particularly useful in revealing. I'll end this introduction with a brief caveat about Ireland. So some of my data refers to both British-born and Irish-born individuals. There's a large historiography on Ireland in Europe, and my main contribution here, I think, is on the British picture. So I tend to say more about Britain than Ireland, although some, but by no means all of what I say could be applied also to the Irish case. I'll begin with historiography then. So many aspects of the study of 18th century British history have enjoyed something of a golden age over recent decades. But the history of Britain in Europe and its limits and divisions has remained largely stinted. So to borrow the phrase with which J.G.A. Pocock launched his appeal for a new British history in the 1970s, the study of Britain in Europe and the British in Europe is an expedition in search of the unknown subject. It's perhaps a little mischievous to reappropriate Pocock's words in order to launch a bid for a better study of Britain within Europe. Pocock's work has been particularly important in conceptually framing the writing of a refurbished British national history. But this programme, while flexibly extensible to encompass not just different Atlantic archipelago prisms, but also British colonial contexts, is one that's been resistant to the notion of dilution into a European mix. Pocock's prescription for British history was that this should be the study of a society and an identity construed around a sovereign polity. This came with related anxiety, though, over, in his words, being melted down into Europe. More specifically, a generation of scholarship has taken as its starting point the proposition of Linda Colley that Britons define themselves, quote, in conscious opposition to the other beyond their shores, and more specifically that they define themselves against the French as they imagine them to be, superstitious, militarist, decadent, and unfree. Whatever the virtues or otherwise of this dialectic model of identity, an unfortunate corollary of this approach has been a relative lack of scholarly attention to the question of British engagement across the Channel. The remarkable caveat that Colley proposed to her own work on Britons, namely that, quote, continental connections were always as influential and as multifarious as transatlantic ties and other imperial networks, this is tended to pass unnoticed. British history also happened in continental Europe, yet this remains largely terra incognita for historians of Britain. In one critique, the historian of France and Paris, Daniel Roche, has concluded that existing research into Franco-British links in the 18th century remains highly uneven, and in particular the studies of the British presence in the French capital represents only, quote, the superficial froth, without giving due weight to the variety of social levels and to the various rhythms at which individuals in transit or actually established abroad participated differently in cultural transfers. Insofar as wider patterns of British engagement with the continent have been studied, this has tended to remain cantonized into a series of specialist subfields, which only rarely are brought into dialogue. So, as well as studies of the grand tour and leisured travel more broadly, there now exist substantial scholarly literatures on cross-channel themes such as dynastic links, diplomacy, Catholic mobility, Jacobite networks, Huguenot diasporas, and entrepreneurship, especially the role of British expatriates in early industrial development across the Channel. This These areas tend not to be brought together, though, by scholarly synthesis, and that picture is further compounded by areas of outright historiographical neglect. So only rarely, for example, do existing studies stray very far from the social elite. Workers and servants and other poorer groups remain largely unknown, and even mercantile networks scarcely better so. Colonial dimensions of British engagement with Europe are also mainly an untold story. Given all this, it's perhaps unsurprising that little attempt has been made to come to an overview of the disjointed and lacunary fabric of 18th century British connections with the continent from existing work. Revealingly, too, the main exception in this regard, namely the important and groundbreaking work of Stephen Conway on similarities, connections, identities, interlacing the channel, this is a work of necessity as much one of original research as it is one of synthesis. If, as Daniel Roche's remarks just cited indicate, the case of Britons in the French capital exemplifies many of the pitfalls of existing scholarship on cross-channel lives, a study of Paris also potentially offers opportunities for a corrective to this, integrating study of different aspects of Britain's continental connections. The role of the revolution as it played out in relation to the British in the French capital, indeed, provides a context which responds to a further key challenge posed by Roche. Quote, what is it which makes the usually invisible foreigners visible at a particular moment? Ultimately, though, to fathom something of the wide and complex spectrum of cross-channel trajectories and interfaces requires not just a particularly favorable research terrain, but also another conceptual approach, going beyond even an ample sense of the British abroad. I argue that only when historiography takes an interest in lives which at some point ceased to be obviously British, or perhaps never unequivocally were so in the first place, will it be able to engage substantively with the full spectrum of British quote-unquote engagement with Europe. What were the edges of British as a subject, and what were the scope for and extent of elisions and hybridity and of grey area transnational lives? Here it may be useful to think whether an analogy might be made between the limits of British subjecthood as a category of belonging for historical actors and of British history as a subject. A host of work on colonial worlds and liminal spaces has explored such mixed and complex situations of flux. Similarly, to discover where Britain blended into Europe, to tell more than island stories and their imperial and post-imperial extensions, we have to be prepared to leave behind a bounded British history populated with clear-cut Britons. Instead, it's necessary to attend to the blurry edges between inclusion and exclusion in Britishness and the larger life worlds, whether British or not, in which such individuals actually existed. I'll turn now to consider the existing picture that we have on Britain and the French Revolution and the British and Revolutionary France that takes us up to this moment in October 1793 of mass arrest. The French Revolution has been explored in relation to British history mainly through how it was discussed in what has been retrospectively labelled a debate about revolution, which developed in Britain from 1789 onwards. Scholarly work over recent decades has significantly revised our understanding of this conjuncture. It's been argued notably that debate is something of a misnomer, since any understanding of the revolution in France for an audience across the Channel in Britain and Ireland necessarily involved that phenomenon being reformulated in fundamental ways. Thus, as Pocock wrote, it was not the case that the model of France was simply, quote, the text to be rewritten. If there had already existed an English radical discourse capable of reformulating the text of Hanoverian politics, it would have possessed its own structure and subtexts and must have striven to contextualize and assimilate any discourse reaching it from France. And in this section, I should say, I'm in some ways speaking to the virtues of Pocock's account of a national framework for understanding Britain's relations with the French Revolution. Ultimately, purported debate on France in 1790s Britain would morph into what may more properly be described as a political and polemical struggle whose terms were overwhelmingly dynastic. The French Revolution itself provided only a limited offstage cue and comparator rather than a true font of origin or ideal. Moreover, had the British even ever wished to conduct a veritable debate about the French Revolution, it's unclear that they would have had the relevant materials to hand. For alarmist comment in Britain, with Edmund Burke leading the charge, the porosity of borders was such as to place the country at risk of inundation by seductive and dangerous French-style revolutionary propaganda. As seen from Paris, conversely, it became a truism that the British were utterly misguided about the events and nature of France's revolution, victims of a malign London government assisted by a corrupted domestic press. This went to the heart of French Revolution analyses and indictments of British politics and society. Britons, having been so often told that they were free, and having even convinced themselves of the truth of this, were unaware that they in fact lived in chains. Drawing on this rhetoric, a handful of British and Irish expatriates from revolutionary Paris launched a series of projects to publish English language newspapers in the French capital, which would then be sent across the Channel for dissemination. These ventures, chief amongst which was the Paris Mercury, shown here, were pitched as curative to the malaise of hostile misinformation regarding France, which characterized the existing British media scene. Overall, though, the process by which foreign news reached British audiences might best be characterized as through a glass darkly. Turning now to the British and revolutionary France, the fortunes of this group at this juncture, so expatriates of various stripes, form one point at which this British debate, or otherwise on the French Revolution, seems to touch on the source of that ongoing revolution. Notably, revolutionary Paris would play host to an array of important names in the history of British radicalism or reform, including Paine and Wollstonecraft. The transfer to France of such central figures in contemporary British radical scene reinforced a sense that France's revolutionary and by late 1792 republican politics had eclipsed the limits of British freedom. The calling of a national convention in late 1792 on the basis of universal male suffrage, and then especially marked a new departure in European history, one which appeared fundamentally to relativize British pretensions to exemplary status. Meanwhile, though, the fall of the French monarchy on the bloody day of 10th August 1792, and then the September massacres the following month, prompted something of a sea change in British public opinion, with a new hardening of attitudes against fast radicalizing France. Britons in France would become entangled in and play a key role in this larger Franco-British polemic over this critical interlude. In France, for the partisans of this new and more radical phase of the revolution, the British state began to appear less a natural enemy and less a natural ally in liberty for France, and more a constitutionally retrograde potential antagonist. Conversely, this new orthodoxy held that the British people were sympathetic to the revolution and assumed that they might be on the brink of effecting a similarly revolutionary change within Britain. So this twin logic, a conspiracy theory about the British state and a fantasy about the British people, would become a lodestar of policy. These shifts would upend the flattering ideological position in which British expatriates in France had theretofore found themselves. For before the radical turn of the revolution, Britons in France had in effect been able to ride two horses, in that voicing a commitment to the revolutionary cause there had not necessarily entailed any outright rejection of existing British societal and political frameworks. From August 1792, however, expatriates' best immediate path to continued unmolested residence in France would lie in self-presentation as avatars of a future revolution in Britain. The withdrawal of the British embassy at this juncture further spotlighted expatriate stances. The two states wouldn't go to war for another 6 months, and yet the vacuum occasioned by the absence of an official British diplomatic presence in Paris allowed scope for surrogate actors to emerge as self-appointed spokesmen for expatriates, and by extension as proxies for the British people as a whole. To some extent, this allowed the British in France to present themselves as having undergone a kind of internal revolution in miniature, displacing their old regime elite for a new order and showcasing a successful paradigm of what might be undertaken in Britain itself. This dynamic briefly gained a kind of institutional form with the establishment of the so-called Friends of the Rights of Man, a Paris-based group of British and Irish revolution enthusiasts. But this venture rapidly collapsed, and its existential crisis seems to have turned on whether it should become a veritable factory for exporting revolution, a kind of British Jacobin club in exile, as a minority of its backers hoped. With war felt to be imminent, it proved impossible to bring a majority of those involved in the venture to support publicly such a revolutionary stance. Doing so would have reduced the group to becoming an adjunct of the French government, and would have rendered problematic any return to Britain or Ireland by individuals subscribing to it. Various other foreign groups in France proved far more plausible and serviceable to the revolutionary cause. The British and the Irish, conversely, failed to be even a paper tiger. merely maintaining a talking shop in the form of the Friends of the Rights of Man proved unsustainable. With this failure, instead of modelling revolution for Britain and Ireland, expatriates from these countries had instead become enfranchised the avatars of the failure of such hopes. Ultimately, they came to be included in, and perhaps to be the new leading elements in, a reading of the British people now no longer seen as fellow sans-culottes seeking true liberty, but rather as the worst of counter-revolutionaries, slaves who had come to love the chains of their seeming freedom. From being able to marry both British loyalties and a commitment to revolutionary France, and even representing a possible bridge across the Channel, expatriates became seen as traitors to both causes and as some of the most reprehensible components in Franco-British interchange. In France, vituperation aimed at Britain, and more particularly at Britons in the midst of the Republic, would culminate during the Terror, a series of espionage and subversion allegations centering on British expatriates, heightened tensions and prompt repressive measures by the French government, and these are crowned in October 1793 when reports reached Paris that the British-led intervention force occupying Toulon in the south of France had killed not one but two members of the convention who were in their custody. These two men, Beauvais and Bayle, are quickly cast as revolutionary martyrs. Here you see a sketch by Jacques-Louis David for a never-completed tableau showing revolutionary martyrs. This episode, it transpired months later, was in fact fake news. Beauvais was unharmed in British custody and would soon be released, and Bailly had died, but by suicide. The convention, though, assuming the reports of their murder to be true, had rushed to respond by issuing its decree that all subjects of George III living in France were to be arrested and imprisoned. I turn now to my section on a more quantitative analysis. With the enactment of the October 1793 mass decree of arrest, a large majority of the English, Scottish, Irish, and other subjects of the King of Great Britain, to quote from the targeting text, living in Paris, ended up in prison and remained there throughout the Terror. The situation seems to have been repeated across France. Here I show you a later print showing those imprisoned at Arras. In Paris, the great majority of this enemy civilian presence were arrested. Taking together those arrested with a minority who were permitted to remain at liberty, 500-odd subjects of George III emerged from these Paris records at this juncture. Most of them were born in England, 74%, but with a significant minority from Ireland, 18%, and Scotland, 5%. There were also a handful of individuals from Wales, the Channel Islands, and from British territories and colonies ranging from Gibraltar to Jamaica and from North America to the Indian subcontinent. A sprinkling of Hanoverians completes the general picture and pushes the total just over 500, but these are not included in the statistical analysis I'm giving here. Children under 12 were exempted from arrest if they were in education. There was also a limited exemption for individuals granted worker status, but that proved to be only a narrow window. Perhaps a quarter of men and a relative handful of women thereby are accorded arrest-exempted status. Women and girls are more patchily documented than men and boys, and yet they constitute around 40% of the total. In terms of the terms of the decree offered no recognition to claims, whether based in formal legal processes or in self-descriptions, to have abandoned a given allegiance or to possess a plural or otherwise anomalous subject status. No protections were accorded to quondam subjects of the King of Great Britain, whose avowed or salient loyalties might lie anywhere elsewhere than in Britain, Ireland, or their associated territories. Specifically, the decree appeared to render inadmissible any claims by such individuals to be treated as French. The decree thus implicitly set out the question of allegiance, at least for this target group, as a binary, monolithic, and indelible category ascribed once and for all time. The authorities appear to have treated place of birth as the trump criterion in deciding who was to be arrested, at least in the first instance. According a decisive role to national status as defined by birthplace was attractive to revolutionary officials, precisely because it was an either-or criterion which could not be wished away by sophistical words. And indeed, the arrest decree itself had been co-drafted by Maximilien Robespierre, who's particularly keen on harsh measures. Considerable numbers of expatriates and visitors from across the Channel had, of course, moved away from France, and especially Paris, as the revolution turned towards war, and the Montagnard political ascendancy took shape, and radical measures, culminating in the Terror, began to be felt. But what may be most remarkable is that so many still remain in the French capital, and as I say, these figures are actually incomplete. Some of the ostensibly British and Irish people traced here as living in the French capital in late 1793 were in fact deeply embedded there, where information about length of residence in France survives. 72% claim to have been in the country prior to the 14th of July, 1789, so prior to the revolution. Many had been living there for decades and for the greater part of their lives. Whatever their precise trajectory in coming to France, a shared assumption or hope of many would appear to have been that the interstate conflict between Britain and France would leave them effectively untouched, just as during previous wars between the two countries. The arrest process brought up hundreds of momentary sidelights into the lives and day-to-day activities thereby interrupted. Elizabeth Thompson, who was found in bed at her lodging, claimed to be 8 months into her pregnancy. The officials charged with her arrest sent her to the Paris Commune's police administration for a decision about what to do with her, which led to her being imprisoned. When officials in another part of the city visit an apartment previously occupied by an Englishman named Charles Sheldon, they find that he is gone, but there's a 17-year-old girl there living there named Caroline Loisel. She'd been in his service for the previous 2 years and described herself as having a French father and an English mother and is born in London, so she is accordingly placed under arrest. The handful of people recorded here as born outside Britain and Ireland open up perspectives on the global and imperial aspect of this notionally expatriate population. I'll mention a few of these cases. A governess named Fanny Weldon was arrested having been born in Gibraltar to an English father and a Spanish mother from across the Atlantic. One man born in Jamaica, Charles Summers, was of Irish extraction and was a former abbé, and indeed of recent months had been developing a new occupation as an informant or spy for the British government. A schoolboy, Gabriel Pradine, aged 16, was from Granada. He was born there during the period when the island was a British colony and accordingly was arrested following the decree. But his family was of French extraction and their connections to the island dated back to his period under French rule. There were a couple of women from colonial era Maryland. They had been in Paris since long before the American War of Independence and become nuns at one of the city's English convents. From the other side of the world, among the children arrested were two daughters of Lawrence Gall and Sophia Fortnum, who'd married in Calcutta in 1777 and remained in India for a number of years before returning to Europe. A feature of the colonial-born individuals from the British world represented at Paris at this juncture was that this was largely or wholly a population of Creole European origin rather than colonized subjects. Still, one complex case which may be evoked in this context is that of Jean Glorieux, described as mulatto, who was denounced and jailed in August 1793 for incivism, and specifically for having said that living conditions were better in London than they were in revolutionary Paris. He was also alleged to have described himself as Anglais, English. Even if this did evoke his own word choice, this may have been a figurative remark, being taken by officials in a literal sense. Even so, local officials seem to have been sufficiently persuaded of Glorieux's possible Britishness that when the arrest measures of October 1793 are enacted, they send out a search party to detain him. In reality, it turns out that he's been born in Martinique. But he's not the only individual to become entangled in the arrest measure by error or by accident. A number of United States citizens living in France would be mistaken for British subjects and thereby imprisoned, and often for long periods. Besides such outright misapprehensions, the arrest measures also produced a penumbra of anomalous cases, with place of birth forming the main litmus test for whether individuals were to be incarcerated as subjects of the King of Great Britain. A host of marginal or unique individual histories emerge. On at least one occasion, this leads to the birthplace rule of thumb being quietly abandoned. This involves Pierre Couton, who'd been born in London. His parents, however, were French and he brought to France as an infant and had lived there continuously from the age of 17 months. In his telling, he was French-born in London. Although briefly placed under precautionary arrest, it was quickly decided that his case fell outside the scope of the decree. Although it's interesting to see that officials having some difficulty with their own application criteria. Information also survives about the residential street addresses in Paris, or at least the relevant neighborhood or section of the city, for most of the British and Irish born individuals in this prosopography. It's therefore possible to map where they lived at this juncture, as I show you here. Certain features of this map are predictable given what is already known about the varieties of the British and Irish presence in Paris at the end of the old regime. Several areas emerge with particular population concentrations, and these patterns may be understood as akin to a palimpsest, in that the map overlays different sociocultural dynamics within British-Irish engagement with the city, with these involving different historical temporalities, albeit that all have been radically reduced by the course of the revolution. Most obviously, it would appear from the map that even during the revolution, the Paris seen and lived by Britons remained concentrated chiefly in what under the old regime had been the city's most affluent touristic and commercial arenas, notably on the left bank around the Faubourg Saint-Germain, and then the newly fashionable neighborhoods around the Palais Royal on the right bank, stretching out into richer northwestern suburbs. At the same time, these secular dynamics can be seen as distinguishable from the continuing presence of a long-established religious geography in the city, located in sections mainly in the south and southeast, suburban areas of the left bank. The several English, Scottish, and Irish expatriate Catholic institutions formed a series of discrete communities, with this still being apparent even in the 1793 records. There are fully 85 nuns in this sample of people who are arrested. Besides these various clusters, however, what is arguably the most surprising component to emerge from this map is also its most humdrum feature, namely that it shows a thin spreading of British and Irish residents throughout much of the city, and this is perhaps the surprise. Some of these more dispersed individuals and families either could not afford or did not need or wish to live in areas of the city where they could be assured of finding sizable British-Irish groupings. I turn now to my third and final part, where I take a more qualitative view. So this radical and ambitious attempt to track a substantial foreign presence in a European metropole and to pass it according to arrest criteria was an intervention which at this scale had little precedent. Many of the cases which emerge here might appear broadly recognizable in relation to the national categories which the revolutionary arrest measures of 1793 treated as axiomatic. And much of the social cross-section of the Britons, quote unquote, who emerge here turn out to be more or less the kinds of people one might have assumed would be there, offering a kind of residuum of the channel crossing trajectories dating back to the old regime. So the main British engagement with Paris had long been the tourist trade. This, of course, had dwindled to a trickle by late 1793. Even so, not a few of the Britons who are found in this sample are living in Paris for retirement, for education, for apprenticeship in trades, and so on. Others from the sample here, in some measures, represent a further ghost in the machine element of the infrastructure surrounding leisure travel, with lines of employment ranging from hotel keepers to wine merchants, bank clerks, and so on. There were large numbers of servants, many of them out of work, as one might imagine. Still others were involved in the wider Paris economy. Some were technologists whose careers in France can be linked to a historiography around culture transfer, for example, bringing British know-how in proto-industry. Others, though, had still more workaday lives with cobblers, saddlers, plasterers, and other manual trades. These were not necessarily connected to any particular selling point based around their British origins. And here, perhaps, we begin to encounter aspects of cross-channel interchange which are more unexpected than existing historiography would lead us to. But let's turn now to away from some of the more familiar elements to the least familiar and most expected types of life histories which emerge from this episode. For a significant minority of this population who became caught up in the arrest decree, categorization as foreign or as Britons proved to be something of a misfire and a teleology. Many failed to conform to these black and white national categories that the revolution seeks to impose. First, as has already been hinted at in the case of Pierre Couton, described as at the time of his arrest as French-born in London, there is this significant French presence across the Channel in Britain and in Ireland, and the border crossing interchange this might involve is highlighted in the presence in Paris in 1793 of a significant minority of British and Irish-born figures who are from French backgrounds or from families which reflect Franco-British intermixing. In some cases, we encounter a French expatriate presence across the Channel, which stems mainly around commerce and employment, so a familial trade or professional context sometimes itself suggests possible grounds for itineracy. For example, one of those who seems to have avoided arrest is Jean Rochefort, a ballet dancer aged 37, born in London to a prominent French dancing family. Some individuals born to French families established in Britain were demonstrably Catholic. This is not simply a question about religion. In other cases, though, we can trace the continuing influence of religious dynamics at play in cross-channel space. Huguenot links and legacies were important in this nexus. Britain had been, of course, a major place of refuge for Protestants fleeing from France over the previous 2 centuries, fostering significant diasporic communities. This involved a degree of back and forth across the Channel over ensuing generations. Jewish cross-channel links provide another such transnational field. Of course, there are various cases of Britons in 18th century Paris who happen to be Jewish or Huguenot in their background, and yet whose activities there, whether for leisure or for work, would appear to have been effectively indistinguishable from those of their wider compatriots. But in some cases, at least, birth in Britain or Ireland appears more as an accident or as a reflection of a family in movement, but ultimately one with little lasting mooring in a British or Irish context. David Lonory, aged 56, a jeweler, may exemplify such a family cursus. He appears in the 1793 records, again, but through his occupation, apparently not arrested. Although born in London and baptized there in a Huguenot church, he'd then been brought to the French capital in early infancy, later obtaining letters of naturality under the old regime, therefore regularizing his position in terms of property, which describe his father as English but of French extraction. When his mother, Henriette Rouff, dies in Paris in 1753, she is interred as a Protestant. It's unclear if the links with Britain or with London, which gave rise to his birth there, were ones which were lasting beyond early childhood. In the case of Jewish diasporas, given the existence of discrimination against Jews in both British and French contexts, but in somewhat different forms and degrees, there were marginal opportunities which France might offer and Britain might not, and vice versa. And in this context, international commerce was a field in which diasporic links might prove to be both an asset and to some extent self-renewing. From the present postopography, one case to emerge is that of Rachel Del Monte and her family. Born in London, she married there at the Bevis Mark Synagogue in 1773 to Jacob Pereira, who is from Bayonne in France. Together with their daughter Felicity, also born in London, they then appear to have moved to Paris around 1789. There, Pereira establishes a tobacco manufactory and becomes a notable Jacobin, being sent back to London as a kind of French spy over 1792 to 3. Subsequently, having returned to Paris, he then becomes caught up in revolutionary faction politics and is guillotined. His wife and daughter then stay on in France. In both the realms of Huguenot and Jewish links then, a legacy of diasporic religious connections to some extent blurs into more open-ended business, trading and travel links across the Channel. The dimensions of these larger horizons might be specifically Franco-British. Sometimes, though, the personal histories involved go well beyond the France-British dyad alone. Quite a few individuals and familial histories may be said to have been tied up with a particular role of urban centres of exchange, such as London and Paris, which were in some senses borderless. Others still point to the economic dynamism of various colonial contexts. I'll mention some of these more vociferous cases then. For instance, Philip Coronello, aged 28 and employed in clerical work, had been born in London, where his father, himself a native of Livorno in Italy, had been a courier for the French legation. James and John Milligan, or Van Milligan, aged 18 and 11, were the London-born children of Dutch parents who, after meeting in Batavia, had then taken up residence in Britain, with the family then moving on to Paris in 1790. Elizabeth Iser, or Heiser, a former mistress in the fashion trade, protested against her arrest by affirming that she had no links to Britain beyond the happenstance of having been born there. Her parents were from Brussels, and they'd moved to Birmingham when her father had gained work at a manufactory there. The family then moved on to Paris in 1769 when she's aged just 3. Yet another arrestee, Geneviève Bisi, aged 28, was the daughter of an Italian father and an English mother. Born in Chelsea, she spurned being considered as a British, claiming to be, quote, so much a foreigner to that country as not to know a word of the English language. Some of these trajectories were tied up with the cosmopolitanism of the 18th century leisured elite. The Bisi family acknowledged, for example, quote, a very light stain of Italian nobility. Others, though, were from far more modest backgrounds, with the underlying migrancy built more around work than around leisure. Occasionally, this ran close to a border-crossing economy of makeshifts with the risk of poverty close at hand. Thus, when Elizabeth Iser's father died a year after the family's arrival in Paris, following their sojourn in early industrial Birmingham, her mother was left without resource and had therefore placed her daughter in the La Salpêtrière poor hospital to be brought up at the charge of the state. Whatever the precise social and economic framework involved, a shared feature of this variety of vociferous trajectories is that the terms of reference of the border crossing experience was such as to exceed the parameters of a French-British duality in narrowly defined senses. And as such, these cases also open up some of the pitfalls of the nation-based identification criteria privileged in the French revolutionary policing interventions of 1793. Individual petitioning for release from arrest as British subjects offers a further crystallization of some of these issues, and this is my final main point. Here I'll show you a one-page petition, this by Marie Adelaide Bourke, born in Bristol, but transported to France at the age of 5 years by order of my dying mother in order to be brought up in the religion at that point dominant in this country, in France. This is a nice example, I think, because the author's handwriting imitates a printed text, helping to distinguish the petition text itself from the cursive annotations and stamps signifying its bureaucratic processing. So that gives you a sense of the bureaucratic machine. Plus also, perhaps a sense that in this case, at least, we know that this person actually would have written this petition. There's always the question about how far amanuenses are being used, of course. Petitioners were obliged to navigate the question of national affiliation, which the October 1793 arrest decree had rendered so salient. In a sense, this conjuncture, representationally, may be said to have simultaneously made those encompassed within the decree's terms both more foreign, in the sense of being bracketed as subjects of the King of Great Britain, and for some of them, this is the first time that they feel themselves as forced to grapple with this label and put in proximity with a foreign community, and jail is the making of a community that had never otherwise been united. But at the same time, simultaneously, this measure also potentially makes those affected more French, giving that articulating a countervailing affiliation with France in its revolution appeared the surest way to escape arrest. Seen in this light, the individuals under scrutiny are largely to be located at some point on a spectrum between Britishness and Frenchness, or potentially some third country. And the heuristic challenge therefore becomes one of assessing the particular national or multinational identity status of given individuals, or indeed of the affected population as a whole. Arguably, though, such an analytical schema is inadequate precisely because of the salience it assumes for national categories. For this assumption itself constitutes the fundamental violence which was being performed within the logic of the revolutionary arrest decree. In this context, the work of scholars who have underlined the easily overlooked phenomenon of national indifference offers a way of escaping from and relativizing the assumed priority of national characterizations inhering in the 1793 arrest measures. So as the historian Tara Zara has observed in relation to a later period and place, but in remarks which might well be applied to this context too, rather than, quote, assuming that people in Europe belong to nations, perhaps we should assume indifference and investigate how and why people allied themselves politically, culturally, and socially from the ground up. In this sense, the ascription of national status, which forms the seeming starting blocks of the 1793 conjuncture, so French, British, Irish, and the like, but also related notions such as patriot, compatriot, or expatriate, these form not the basis of analysis, but instead are themselves what require deconstruction. Arrest and imprisonment may thus be said to have created, rather than merely recorded, the essentialist and binary national categories to which they accorded such punitive potency. Invoking such categorizations as though these collectives were self-evident entities turns out, as Zara argues, to be itself an immediate heuristic handicap, not least in that it leaves out individuals who remained altogether aloof to the nation's appeal. It is interesting that this group has to, on the one hand, they don't look very, very much like convincing Britons in the sense that what are they doing in the heart of the French Revolution in the middle of the Terror. At the same time, they're quite conspicuously not fighting on the front lines for France. So it's this national indifference. They will have to. The struggle to identify themselves as French patriots is slightly undermined by the fact that they're not. They're actually somewhat behind in coming forward. Indeed, some of the most strident claims to national status may have been simply the speech acts required of an individual in order to survive a particular polemical moment. To quote Zara again, in a world of national hierarchies, identity cards, which by the way are being invented in Paris precisely at this moment and produce some of my data, identity cards and national ascription, many individuals were simply talking back to nationalists in national terms, talking back to nationalists in nationalist terms. In such conjunctures, rather than discovering veritable recitations of national affiliations and sympathies, the historian may in fact be reconstituting a history of individuals who stood outside or on the margins of national imagined communities. And for Zara, such trajectory should be neither romanticized nor pathologized. Only a brave or quixotic petitioner in the French capital in late 1793 would seek explicitly to advertise a sentiment of outright national indifference. Still, the multitude of individual claims to have shed national allegiance and have replaced this with an unmitigated loyalty to revolutionary France might be said to amount to much the same thing. Petitions were certainly liable to be read and rejected by the authorities in Paris in such terms. The revolutionary politician Louis de Saint-Just, who is charged by the convention to respond to this moment of petitioning and disquiet about the law, does so by declaring that even the most iniquitous of enemy foreigners still retain one last virtue, namely that of loyalty to birthplace, with their hearts remaining, quote, rooted there like a tree rooted in the soil. The uprooting or transferal of such loyalty, conversely, marked, in his words, a depraved character, with even that final virtue lost. In a sense, being nationally flexible or indifferent in this way appeared almost worse even than being British. Or perhaps this slipperiness was a further aspect of what made Britain so dastardly. A few words of conclusion. It may seem a bit gratuitous to move directly from Louis de Saint-Just to J.G.A. Pocock. After all, the coherent British historiographical framework championed by Pocock was one which, in significant measure, he conceived against his sense of the horrors of mid-20th century totalitarianism, which engulfed continental Europe, and whose roots he saw in part as traceable to 1790s France and its terror. Still, I argue that there is some overlap between, on the one hand, Saint-Just's horror at the depravity of individuals who shed their national allegiance, and on the other hand, Pocock's hostility to the possibility of British history being melted down into Europe. Methodological nationalism has certainly allowed and continues to foster validation and understanding of the distinctiveness of the arena constituted by Britain and Britain in the world, including, as we've seen in the first part of my paper today, some aspects of British engagement with Europe and even with the French Revolution. But arguably in this instance, it risks blinding us to the historical reality that some Britons, or at least some people from Britain, did melt down into Europe. Transnational history, and more specifically scholarship on national indifference, may offer a better guide for conceiving of such trajectories. If we lose sense of this part of the spectrum of channel crossing, we effectively pre-limit and foreclose our scope for analysis to archipelago or island stories and their imperial extensions. Thank you very much.